the recording. All right, we're good to go. What do you guys want to talk about?
I have a question about that.
Yeah, totally.
So, so you know how like the governor made a bill and it's been going through that long ass like process that it goes through. So, um, like what people are in charge of approving those things? That's I don't know. I'm curious about that.
Well, so I'm most familiar with how bills pass through at the federal level, but I believe at the state level it's very similar, where there's kind of a House of Representatives, then there's a state Senate, and it has to pass through those bodies, and eventually it gets to the governor, who is essentially the executive equivalent of the president for a state. So it has to go through those different bodies. It ideally gets passed back and forth. There are compromises made between at least the two parties. Um, and then each of those bodies must approve. A majority of those bodies must approve that bill for it to pass through. Is that what you're asking about?
Yes.
Yeah, that's generally the system.
What doesn't make sense to me is that the people making the decisions are usually a lot older and aren't as affected by that decision as to where people around my age are mostly affected.
Yeah. So do you think if there were more young people representing the population, that there would have been a different decision made? Do you guys get the sense that there is a generational divide here, and that might explain a lot of the difference in opinion on abortion?
Yes, and I think if it was like people my age, like or a decent portion of people my age, in the government, that could make a decent bit of the decisions, I think it wouldn't have been passed.
Do y'all agree with that?
Yes.
I don't necessarily know if I agree with that. Just I think you said this 10 years ago. I would absolutely agree. But I think there has been a lot of um, evidence to suggest that there is this trend among younger people, like college age, Gen Z, so people 18 to like 22ish, that there is a rise in conservatism. Um, I mean, if you look at Madison Cawthorn in North Carolina, he's the youngest person ever elected to the House of Representatives. He's 25, and he's definitely conservative. So I don't necessarily know if that is the like. So I see what you're saying, and I definitely agree that there is a tendency of younger people to be more liberal, left-leaning, progressive, whatever you want to call it. But I don't necessarily know that if in South Carolina, if people were younger, if that would have been a different result. Just because I think we're hitting this point where it's not necessarily a generational divide anymore.
Well, I think so. A lot of my friends who are conservative, I just happen to have a lot of friends who are conservative, and they actually are. They aren't as against abortion as I thought they would be. But that's just like my friend group, it could be different around.
Yeah, it's possible that individual opinions are changing, even if so. It could be that more people are conservative. I actually see what you're saying, Ali, because you're right. I think that in addition to age, we are going to see these kind of like shifts in belief depending on what a country is currently going through and what kind of things people prioritize. And it could be that conservatism kind of has a wave that is being, I think, jumped on right now. But I also think that there is the potential for the core beliefs of certain groups to change, even if overall they are basically the same. It could be that, say, the opinion about abortion specifically is not holding as much traction as it used to, or something like that. Just Honey, you were going to say something.
When it comes to like that topic, I don't completely understand why like they are like making a decision on someone's body. It's kind of like the way I look at it is like whenever I had a conversation with a teacher like a long time ago, and this is probably not a conversation to say with a teacher, but like for the longest time, she said she did not want to have kids, like at all. And like, in order for her to like, let's say, shut down her lady business, she would have to be, I think, at least 30 because she has a husband, and technically, like, she would have to get permission from him, or she would have to get permission from her father, which doesn't make any sense to me. Like, why should a woman make that decision? Like to have to base that decision off of someone else's opinion. And like personally, when it comes to like abortion, some people slip up. Yes, like a lot of people are very irresponsible, but then again, like some people cannot handle kids at all. And the way I view it is, why bring a child into a lifestyle that you probably can't even support? Like looking at how many kids are in like the system and like aren't even being adopted and just kind of just being left there is so sad, like completely sad. And I get like taking a life, yes, but then again, I would never want to bring a child into a lifestyle that I can't give it 100%. And I don't know, just the way people view it as like, you're just killing. Okay. But what if I was homeless and I have to have this kid? Or what if I can't even afford baby food, even though there are programs out there, but sometimes they're really hard to get into. So it's like, I don't know. That topic just, ooh, it just, I don't know. It just makes me kind of irritated.
Um, I just want to say, me personally, I believe that all this abortion business about it basically depends on the person because I mean, like she was saying, one can support one thing and the other, can't, and then you're out here struggling trying to take care of something that you didn't really want, and then you have those that are planning and trying to have kids but can't. And then that also goes back to the people who can but don't want it, but you have the adoption system, things like that. But at the end of the day, it's just like, there's no right or wrong answer. It can't be, but to make a whole law to decide what somebody else is feeling, that is, I don't know, I feel like that's a little extreme. But at the end of the day, like I said, we all have different opinions on it. So
I wanted to talk about or go in more into about how opinions change over time because like now when you asked about whether or when someone said how the younger generation as they would be able to change like the decision in a way where like the abortion law would not have been passed. I think even no matter like what your belief is, eventually that changes, throughout life. And when you're younger, for those who are more conservative, I feel like those beliefs, even if you have those beliefs, I feel like at a point in time, you would have to choose, something else, especially because of everything that has been, not to mention, how many people are in the world now and those who are getting pregnant and not being able to abort the child that they don't want, whether it be through like the child had been um, born through traumatic circumstances or not. I think that eventually, when it comes to a point in time, like we don't know when this pandemic really is going to be over, and older and younger people are the most affected by COVID at this point. And so when you think about stuff like that, I feel like you would have to make a choice whether to bring like bring people into this world who can't even survive their disease, and they'll still be dead, whether through, you know, the pandemic or through neglect or whatever. I just feel like abortion should not be anyone else's choice except for people who are able to carry the child themselves.
I think this is such a hard conversation, because what we need to do is, as a society, land on some decision that we can all basically agree on. And the problem is, and I think each of you have highlighted this, everyone is going to have slightly different motivations and slightly different amounts of skin in the game, right? So I think one of the big differences probably between younger and older generations is that if you're younger, a lot of your life, I mean, this is a very dark way to say this, but a lot of your life is ahead of you, right? Whereas if you're relatively older, more of it is past. So having a child while you're young and not being able to, say if you get pregnant for whatever reason, not being able to abort that child, there is much more of your life that is potentially to be affected by getting pregnant early on and then not being able to, say, abort that child, compared to if you were older, you may not be having children. And so it's not really too much of a consequence to you, or you may be making that law for, say, I don't know, other people, in which case you're right, you are essentially telling other people how they should have had children when perhaps you were not told how to have children throughout your life. So I feel like there is a generational difference in the kind of, and when I say generational difference, I mean that once younger people get older, overall their beliefs tend to become more conservative. They become more traditional. So the people who were really liberal when they're young, sometimes, I mean, again, this isn't always true, but the pattern is overall people's beliefs tend to become more conservative. Not that they necessarily will. So I think that, again, our priorities, what the kinds of things that we find important are going to change across the lifespan. And I think this is one of those things. I guess I don't know any data on attitudes towards abortion across the lifespan, but I know at least cross-sectionally, meaning if you take younger versus older people tend to have the more conservative belief of, you know, abortions are not good. We should not allow them, or there should be very strict regulation of how we get abortions. So that in my mind is kind of the problem. And so the solution, I feel like I'm hearing a lot here, is we should just leave it up to people's individual choice, right? That we shouldn't even have the law to exist. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable, stance to take. The only problem I see with letting it up to people to make their own decision is that if there's not some kind of law in place that actually protects people's right to get an abortion, which I think is the really important one, then those individuals who are perhaps most vulnerable, or those who are perhaps pregnant and they want to get an abortion, but then they are surrounded by family, friends, society, community, etc., who are pressuring them not to get an abortion, they may not actually have those protections. So I think there's at least some room for law. I think my opinion on this is becoming very clear. I think there's some room for law that protects people's rights to get an abortion. But I am, on the whole, I think in agreement with pretty much everyone here that we shouldn't necessarily be legislating to restrict people's access to abortion. So I don't know if there's anything there that you want to jump on. I can go very deeply into my beliefs, but I don't want to take up the spotlight too much.
When the study that we had to read was talking about, like, the different factors that play into how people perceive. I don't know. This is what I got from the study, but they were trying to show how, like, different factors affect different people's opinions about whether, like, I don't know how to explain it. Like, traditionally, some people think abortions are one thing or another because of, religion or um, other beliefs like that. I think that I just want to know. I don't get it because, well, this also goes into like my own personal belief that, you know, religion in general is kind of like a way to control people. And I get that, yeah, it's here to hold, you know, some people stay moral, but I also think that there are certain aspects that um about, like, you know, certain religions that really control you because they just don't want you, like, they just don't want you to do this, so they say, oh, well, in the Bible it says blah 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 blah. However, there are so many different versions of the Bible that say different things from the same verse, that you can take completely different. So for those factors to play a role in how you decide whether or not, you know, a law gets passed, in this case abortion, for older people, because I feel like those are the ones who are really really active in making the laws that restrict abortion. I think that um, even if you don't agree, I feel like some people, it should be where um, it would be hard to get an abortion, but it's not where you can't get them at all. So you have to sit down and actually think about, okay, what is the best option for me, and how am I going to get through this afterwards? Because people can just be careless and say, oh, I can just get an abortion. Oh, I can just get an abortion. But after a while, like, that takes an effect on your body and your mental health, even if, like, that's what you were going in for. So I think that, yeah, I agree that there should be laws to, like, make it just slightly harder, at least.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So harder to the degree that we can prevent any harm that would be caused by getting an abortion. I will, is that right?
Yes.
I'll say this. So I've looked into the research on abortion just because I think it's important. I think some people, I've had plenty of students write papers on abortion, but I also think it's just important to kind of be up to date on what abortion can do. For the vast majority of people, for the vast majority of women, getting an abortion does not lead to long-term mental or physical health consequences for the vast majority of them. There are some who, especially if, say, they wanted the child and then they were, for one reason or another, forced to get the abortion, that tended to lead to especially mental health consequences, not physical health consequences. Abortions, extremely, extremely physically safe. 30, 40 years ago, when the science was not really up to par, when the procedures were not super, really good, abortions did have a higher chance of damaging some aspects of the reproductive tract. At this point, though, especially the procedures for the first trimester, that is that vacuum aspiration, it's extremely safe. You are very unlikely to experience any kind of complication from that. So the physical challenges, those are kind of out the window. We know pretty confidently that those don't happen for the vast majority of cases. Mental health, it really is going to depend on a person's kind of motivations for getting an abortion. It's going to depend on the support that they receive from their community. So that is, if they get the abortion, are they then shunned by the people around them? If you're shunned by the people around them, I mean, really what's going to happen is our mental health is very closely tied to the opinions of the people that we care about. So if the people that you care about think that you are some kind of pariah, or you're some kind of social outcast at that point, that's probably going to affect you pretty badly. So getting an abortion and then experiencing that is probably going to have a negative effect on you. But if you get the abortion, you wanted it, and other people are at least neutral about it, women tend to have a very good, at least, I mean, they tend to either are even with before, they're just as happy as they used to be, or they're much happier, at least in the short term, given that they do not have to make that investment into a child. So the costs of abortion, physically, mentally, they tend not to be there for the most number of people. However, I will agree with you that to the degree that someone may be unsure about whether they want to get an abortion, maybe they're sitting there and they're thinking, okay, I'm actually really afraid to have a child. I don't know if I can support them. I don't know if I have the support from other people. And so they go back and forth. They may eventually get an abortion, and then they say, actually that was the wrong decision after the fact. Then in those cases, which again are not the vast majority of them, yeah, sounds good, Gonzalo, that can lead to certain kind of problems with anxiety, depression, etc., because of a choice that was made that eventually you didn't want to make. So is there room for waiting to get an abortion? I think there is. I still don't know whether we should have laws in place that force people to wait. I think that it's good to give people that advice of, well, hey, maybe you should wait. I mean, if you're really unsure about this, give it some time. But currently what you see in many states is they might have a waiting period where if you come into the abortion clinic and then you say, I want to get an abortion, what they'll do is they'll actually first give you materials and send you home with those materials. And they'll say, wait 24 hours. If you can come back 24 hours and still want the abortion, then you can. And that's fine. It's good advice, but you're actually required to wait 24 hours. If you're someone who very clearly knows that you want to get that abortion and there could be consequences to waiting 24 hours, such as, I don't know, maybe your spouse didn't want to get an abortion, you're in an abusive relationship, and going home for 24 hours would be a very bad idea. I think that has the potential to harm people. So I think the advice should be there. I don't know if it should be legislated that people have to wait.
But what about, I understand, I completely understand like that whole being forced to wait 24 hours. And I can't, and that's the same thing as me deciding, you know, whether or not you can even have an abortion. But then I think about rash decisions. So even like a lot of, I don't know, how often is it that a person, you know, they find out they're pregnant, and then in a short period of time, in that short period of time when they find out, how, like, from when they find out, how much time between then and like you going to the abortion is enough time for you to really gather your wits about the pregnancy and aborting. Does that make sense?
No, yeah, sure. What does everyone else think about that? Do you think we should be waiting or kind of, I don't know, do we need to, I don't know if force is the right word, but I mean, that's what a law is going to do. It's the aim of forcing people to, at least in this case, wait some time to get their wits about them or to avoid rash decisions, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, when it comes to like abortion, the longer you wait, the more developed the child starts, and that's like the main, let's say, issue. People say, like, you've waited so long, it already has its legs and a heartbeat and stuff like that. So like, yes, I get like a day, but let's say if you find out probably like 2 months later, or like some time, like I know there's like restraints on being able to take the kid out, like it can't be, I think, like more than like 9 weeks. But what if like after that one day the baby is like already formed? And I know it doesn't happen like overnight, but I don't know, like if someone, I've been friends with someone that's had an abortion, so it's like it does take a lot of thought and what you can handle and what you can do or like can't do. But then again, I don't think someone would just be like, I don't want the baby today. But then again, probably want it unless someone persuades them to keep it. And
Right. I guess that's a risk too, is that rather than avoiding making a rash decision, you actually get influenced by someone else to do something that you would have otherwise done had that 24 hours not passed, which again, in situations of coercion, such as domestic abuse, where people are coerced, they're forced into, maybe by threat, to have a child against their will. I mean, that can happen within 24-hour period. So as that's not to say that that should determine what we do, but I guess that the principle of waiting can go both ways. It could move you closer to the quote unquote right decision, but it could also move you further away from the quote unquote right decision. If we consider what's right to be what's going to lead to your best mental health, or what's going to be kind of good for everyone's well-being, et cetera. So I see that actually potentially pushing both ways. And if it can potentially push both ways, I don't know if it should really even be there.
and like back onto like how, let's say, like our like government and everything is like spaced. I understand there's like age limits and like going into the House of Representatives or like Senate, like all of that. But then again, like these older people sometimes have not evolved to what our generations are now. If you look at the past and like kind of like do a similarity and differences, there's so many different things and so many like the way, let's say, our generations now look at different situations are more open to like transgender people and all that stuff. And a lot of older people, I don't know if they're in the House of Senate, whatever, all of that stuff. But like, I get we shouldn't put like 18-year-olds in the House of Representatives. Like, no, there should still be some limits. But then again, we are evolving to a more open generation. And yes, the younger generations are probably a little bit slower, but we're not even going to talk about that. But it's like, I think they should be more open to like self choice rather than trying to limit us into like boxes.
Yeah, I get your argument that actually I think people are becoming more open to a wide variety of things. I don't know if that is something that is unique to this time. I think that throughout history, we've always been kind of more open, more closed to things. And I think one of the kind of eternal struggles that you see between, especially the political, I mean, I think it's super clear to see in the political parties of the United States, is that you kind of have this conflict between those who want to make things, those who want to kind of, I guess using this terminology, make things more open or change things, versus those who want to keep things the same. And there can be many, many, many different, I think, motivations for wanting to open or keep things the same. I think some of them can be malevolent. I think some of them can actually be beneficial. So to the degree that a system works. Now, this is my most generous interpretation of a more kind of conservative traditional outlook on how things should be run, is I think that to the degree that a system works, preserving that system, preserving the practices and policies and the traditions that we have, because they help society work in some way, if they genuinely work to everyone's well-being, I think they're worth preserving. And I think that that tends to be the outlook of maybe someone who's more traditional. But to the degree that that system doesn't work, or that it needs to change to account for something that it does not currently account for, I think that's the merit of kind of a generally a more liberal agenda, more progressive agenda, being open to things, is it's really to address those gaps that exist in the traditional system. So I guess I see merits of both sides. I do think that we're generally becoming more open over time. Society is, I guess, in that sense, progressing. But I imagine those who are older can especially see the merits of preserving certain types of systems that exist, social systems, certain public policies, and et cetera. And again, my most generous interpretation is their aim is they want to preserve the things that they think work and are necessary to keep things working. And if there's too much change, then everything's just going to go off the rails and it's going to crash. I don't know if I necessarily buy into that, but I see the grain of truth to that. I see that there are probably some things worth preserving. Is freedom of speech, or the right to, liberty and the pursuit of happiness and all that stuff, is that worth protecting? Should we worry about people's individual well-being and structure our government around that? I do think so, and I think that that's kind of been a guiding philosophy, but I think there's a lot of wiggle room in there for change to turn the dials here and there to optimize how government works and how it serves the people.
I just can't help but think, like, what if, like, the old laws and then the new laws, like, now, like, how can you, like, as the world evolves, like my age and, of course, other people's age, as you get older, like, are you going to still provide like the same laws even as the world is evolving? Because things change and people change, and of course the environment around us change. So how do you constantly keep trying to keep people at the same bar where the bar is constantly going up?
Yeah, I kind of want to mention one feature that I think factors into this. So if you think about the value of having a child born, I think that if you look at more rural areas where there are already not a lot of people, having a child and contributing that person to the society is probably going to be a huge benefit, because if you have more people, you can get more done, right? I mean, that was the philosophy of, if you have a a pilgrimage of people going into a new land, you should be trying to produce as many children in that new land as possible, because the more hands you have, the easier life gets for everyone. And so I wonder to what degree resistance against abortion might actually come from a long line of traditional beliefs about needing more people in the world. And I think that perhaps in some regions of, especially in the United States, where we have tons and tons and tons of land, and a lot of it is unoccupied still, you might find that in more rural areas, you're probably going to see beliefs against abortion, so that you bring more people into the world, so that you have more hands to help. It's kind of like if you live on a farm, the more children you have, the more free labor you have, right? Versus if you're in the city, and I think right now what we're seeing is that, I mean, we have an overpopulation problem in many parts of the world. And so in certain areas, it might actually be a negative contribution to everyone's well-being to bring another life into existence, to bring more people into a situation that is already populated.
I get that as well. But then, like, what about adoption? Because there are a lot of kids, in the system. Even, and someone did a speech in my class, in one of my classes, about how more kids should get adopted, and it has always been an idea of mine, but I forget about how many other people also think that adoption is, like, a good thing, because in some places at a point in time they had, like, you can even have a certain number of children because of overpopulation. And so even in rural areas, um adoption is a choice, when you don't have a lot of people in your community. um and it would also help with a lot of other things, because there are so many kids who haven't been adopted, and there are so many kids, even when their parents have their child, they still give it away, um, just to say, I don't know, just to say they didn't abort. um, I don't know, or in and not being able to take care of a child is another reason. But I just think that even if you are in a rural country, there are options other than forcing, or quote unquote, I mean, it depends on how they view it in that area, the women, other than forcing the women to have a child because you need more help in the area that you're in.
Agreed. I do think that I mean, if we see adoption as that opportunity to take people from overpopulated areas and distribute them into the less populated areas, you're right. There are alternative solutions to having children, right? I mean, not you don't have to have children in order to bring more people into an area. So to some degree, that logic of let's have children to create more people for say in a rural area, I just don't think it really holds up as much as it used to. We're an interconnected society now. If you live in a remote location, you have a pretty easy connection to the rest of the world, and I think adopting is one of those connections that people have. Yeah, I agree. So here's what one thing I kind of want to do is I want to go back to the idea that when it comes to abortion, what we're trying to do is we're trying to take a collection of people who have different opinions about how, when you're making a law about something, when you're designing public policy, what you're trying to do is you're trying to account for everyone who lives within that society, everyone who is affected by that decision. And I think when you're doing that, you have to have a very clear idea of what your moral stance is, right? What do you think is the moral priority? What should we strive to maximize by making certain policies? So for example, you could make the argument that if we outlaw drug use, that you can't sell any kind of drugs, that your moral stance might be the fewer drugs that are in circulation legally, the better the better people's lives are going to be. So your moral stance, you're trying to increase everyone's well-being. Now, whether you actually accomplish that through banning all drugs or allowing all drugs, you can debate that. So I guess that's the kind of question is, what are we really going for when we are either banning abortion or allowing abortion? And I in my mind, I see kind of two potentially kind of contrasting sets of values here. What I see argued by people who tend to support abortion, they are pro-choice, is that by getting an abortion, by allowing people to get an abortion, what you're doing is you're prioritizing people's subjective experience, their actual experience of how good is the quality of their life. So for example, if you're concerned about the potential mothers or the woman's choice and being able to have an abortion when she wishes, what you're doing is you're prioritizing her well-being to the degree that she has the choice to, if she say has aspirations to go to college, have a career, and she does, and certainly you can do that as a mother, but it gets harder in that situation. So prioritizing her ease of being able to do these things without kind of compromising her time with a child who then might not be receiving 100% of her time. Or if you're prioritizing the child's well-being, and I think, Jasenia, you made this argument, you bring the child into the world, but what is the quality of life of that child, right? Sure, the life is there, and that might be its own virtue, but then is that child actually having a good experience being alive? And I see that as kind of encompassing more anyone who's kind of, I think, is for allowing abortions. I think that seems to underlie a lot of the moral decision making versus those, and this is just my guess because I don't really, I'm not on this side of things, but this is how I perceive it, is if you're against abortions, there seems to be a moral priority put on simply bringing life into existence, as if having life not be extinguished, regardless of the quality of that life, having that life continue to live is really the moral priority. And that I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that as kind of the priority of people who are against abortion, but that's been my perception, is that the highest moral good is simply to bring that life into the world.
So if the question is, I'm talking a lot, but if the question is about morality and like, the betterment of the people, I think that, and you related it to, banning drugs, but I think that if you do something like that, it leads to, back end alleys type of thing. Like, so you ban drugs, there are people that are gonna make, synthetic drugs that mimic the original version, and that really, more often than not, that only leads to, worse. It leads to a lot of death, a lot of, just generally bad things. So I see that as the same thing with abortion. So if you cut off the ability to abort, that starts to open up doors for people to do it behind closed doors, which ends up being something that, like, would affect life rather than help it. And so
Right. Right.
if
No, you're
morality is playing an issue, you would think about, oh, this is really only going to make a lot of things a lot worse than it is now, rather than um, help people. Because I feel like those who are thinking in a sense of, what's good and what's bad, is based off of a belief, and then that belief is not shared by everyone. So
right. So I'm sympathetic to that logic, and I think that applies to a lot of things. It applies to the legalization of drugs, the legalization of abortion, the legalization of sex work, for example. The idea is with sex work specifically, sex workers who are, if it's illegal, what you then have to do is you have to do it underground, where there may be far fewer protections, right? That when you legalize something, yes, you make it more widely available in some sense, but it also becomes better regulated, such that if someone is committing violence against a sex worker, or the proper regulation of sexual disease transmission, for example. If you go to the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, sex work is legal there. It's publicly legal, and so they actually have a section, the red light district, dedicated specifically to people who are shopping around to find someone to have sex with. But they have very, very strict regulations about STI testing and making sure that everyone's safe in the process. And so what happens is, yes, people have greater access to it, but when it happens, it's far safer. So you're prioritizing people's well-being in that sense. So yes, I'm sympathetic to that logic, and I do think that it applies to abortions as well. That if it's illegal, here's the complicated thing. I think if it's illegal, there are probably some people who are just simply not going to get it because it's illegal. I think a lot of people are against breaking, there are a lot of people who just don't want to break a law for the sake of not breaking a law. They don't want to get punished, right? So I think you are probably going to stop some people from getting abortions. But you're right, there are then going to be those people who are going to get it anyway. And when they do get it anyway, they do it in a way that's potentially harmful, where they maybe rely on a doctor that is not certified, because the doctor who is not certified has no license to lose, right? Or they try to do it themselves through I don't know if I've ever used the term DIY abortion, but that's essentially it, right? I think that you're right that there is a cost to restricting certain things. Now, how we balance that with, is there a nice middle ground? Maybe there is, but I agree with you generally, yeah. So I bring up this question of, we need to figure out what our moral standpoint is here, because I kind of want to compare. I want to see what everyone thinks in this class is. So you have these two alternatives, and maybe this is a false dichotomy. Maybe this is a false choice. But if you had to prioritize the quality of someone's life versus the virtue of simply bringing life into existence, to making sure that that life is not extinguished, which of those two things should we be prioritizing? I mean, which of those two things should be the basis for what we consider morally right? Is it well-being? Is it the actual experience that people have while they're alive? Or is it simply the fact that they are alive?
I mean, the quality of someone's life usually like enhances the experience like completely. So like if someone is born into a family that, let's say, can't afford to replace their clothes every single year and they have to wear the same exact clothes, kids aren't nice. So it's sad to say, but that kid might become, let's say, suicidal, and he doesn't like his life, or she doesn't like her life. And like, yes, everyone can't have like a rich lifestyle. Like that's not like what I'm specifically saying, but I know the experience of life and how you come up is kind of gonna influence like how you kind of feel, or like what you're gonna kind of do on a daily basis. I know there were kids that got bullied to the point where they just completely disappeared, or they killed themselves, or they just ignored it. And yes, some kids can just ignore it. They have a strong will, they have a strong backbone, but then some kids can't. So it just it's kind of hard to determine that whenever it's just like a fetus. But then again, it's like I personally, I wouldn't want to bring my child into a situation where they might get bullied on a daily basis, because bullying isn't fun. Like, or being bullied isn't fun. So it's like I would never want my kid to have to deal with someone picking on them because of their clothing, or picking on them because they probably couldn't take a shower that day, or like it's just based upon like what what you want for that future in the kid. And I believe like if my kid can't just live its life and not have to deal with it, or not have to deal with other people, it's kind of like if you want to bring your kid up into like, oh my goodness, bring your kid up into a life that they can handle criticism or handle someone picking on them. That's like, if you can teach them how to just move forward from that, that's fine. But some people can't, or some people are worried about, let's say, paying their bills. And if some people are living check to check, and they can't really like interact with that child as much as they want, it's kind of like you're leaving the child in the dust, and they might not be able to handle certain things that is thrown at them.
And even if perhaps they could handle it, the question is, should they have to? I mean, people can survive all kinds of really crazy circumstances, but what's the point of the struggle if the whole time you are struggling? It is immense suffering. I mean, you might have a goal at the very end, but there's kind of no guarantee of that. And I guess what I'm trying to add is, even if someone can personally handle something, that doesn't mean that there aren't other obstacles that we could kind of get rid of, so that they don't have to have that, have those, they don't have to go, struggle through it. I think that there are many challenges in life that I think give life the spice that it has, right? If we weren't challenged at all, I don't know how good the quality of life would be. But I think that there are many challenges that are unnecessary. And so if you are bringing a child into a circumstance where they are perhaps facing an immense number of unnecessary harms, I don't know if that's worth it. But anyone else kind of want to speak on this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm much more concerned with the well-being and the quality of life of someone who is already living, right? Like, there's always this argument that you're affecting someone else's life if you have an abortion, but the people making the argument don't ever seem to take into account the person who is, like, the quality of life, not even necessarily the quality of life, but like sometimes even the actual health of the person carrying this child, like how that is affected by pregnancy. And in no other situation is someone expected to risk their own health and well-being for the potential to save someone else, right? Like even after death, like if you are not a signed off organ donor and you die, and then someone's like, yeah, we need your heart is great for this operation or whatever, and you did not sign off on that, they cannot take away your heart even though you're dead. So like, why do we give more bodily autonomy to people who are dead without much thought to it, but we don't give the same bodily autonomy to people who are pregnant? And so like that's all, like that's just how it is, I think, because it's not just the option, like it's not just life versus no life. It is so many a myriad of intertwining details that seem to kind of get left out of the conversation a lot of times.
Yeah, if the priority is well-being versus just simply whether life exists or not, I think that has a number of implications for the kinds of decisions or kinds of laws that we end up passing. For example, if our priority is people's well-being, then a law that restricts abortion simply by whether a heartbeat exists doesn't really make a lot of sense. Because what is it about a heartbeat that would decide whether a child should be, I mean, how do you all feel about that? I mean, should a heartbeat be the point at which we decide whether an abortion is legal or not?
That's kind of my question. Like, where is that fine line of are they gonna, can you abort them or not? And then when you get to that fine line, it's like, okay, it's only one more day. So is that one day really that big of a difference? And you can get into a lot more other things on that fine line.
Yeah, where should that fine line be if not
Like,
heartbeat?
that's a good question. I don't have, like, let's say the fine line is 2 months, right? Or 3 months. And what makes it human at 3 months and not 2 months and 29 days?
Yeah. One thought I have is, so again, if we kind of look at what our moral priority here is, the well-being of something, I think it's really hard to predict in the future, is this child going to have a good life? But there is a way that I think that we can actually measure well-being, or in another way, measure how much suffering the child would experience by virtue of being aborted. Turns out, and we could argue this, but one of the metrics by which we could measure suffering is how much pain the fetus would experience, right? So we would say that something would be immoral if it causes immense pain to something. I think that if you were put anyone in a situation where they were experiencing unnecessary amounts of pain, we'd say no. I don't think that let's try to solve that, right? If we use that as a metric, the nervous system of a fetus is not capable of processing pain completely until about week 27 or so, and that's pretty far along in a pregnancy. That's like end of the second trimester, almost beginning of the third. And the reason for that is around that time, so the nervous system is established pretty early on. The nervous system is established by like between week 3 and 5. I should say the foundation of it is established. It then develops across the lifespan of gestation. And so it has a nervous system. It has the neurons that are responsible for transmitting pain, but a lot of the receptors that are required for the experience of pain, that is the brain actually creating that subjective experience of, ow, I don't like that, you won't get that until about week 27. So if we're arguing that we want to minimize suffering, we want to maximize well-being, I think that is one potentially arguable cutoff point, about 27 weeks, but that's very different from heartbeat, which is 6 weeks. I don't know what y'all think about that.
I think that makes a lot of difference in between the difference between when you can first register a heartbeat and when the fetus is even able to experience pain. I think it makes a lot of difference as to whether um, um, somebody can somebody can get an abortion or not. And so I think that if that's the case, that should put a lot more emphasis on, like, quote unquote deadlines, um, and like the cutoff line when you can or can't get an abortion.
Something I think should be considered also when looking at the cutoff line. I don't know if scientists have figured this out yet, but when consciousness is like reached in the fetus, I think that should also play a big role.
That's a tough one. That's a tough mark
Yeah,
to draw because we actually don't entirely understand, first off, what consciousness is. We have a pretty good idea of kind of what the experience is, but we still don't entirely know when it, like, what all contributes to its how it arises. And so really being able to say that a fetus has consciousness at this point but not at this point, that's really hard to say. I mean, there are some people who I think don't think that, like, dogs or rats have consciousness. I would argue they do, but yeah, where consciousness begins, that's a really fuzzy line right now. But that's an interesting one. I guess it's possible that if you are conscious at some point, that could lead to, so if you know that you exist, or you realize you exist, or you have the experience of existing, then for that existence to be ended, would that be causing suffering? Because that would be your argument, right?
the argument would be like I guess suffering, but like just how do I explain this? That I wouldn't take like physical suffering, but like or ooh, I'm trying to think how to explain myself here. Okay, like there wouldn't technically be any suffering, but that because like once that the thing is dead, obviously it wouldn't be suffering, and if it can't feel pain, it wouldn't suffer, and it really wouldn't know it's dead until after that passed. But then it just wouldn't get that chance. But that is a good point you make about. I don't know how to explain myself here.
There are some philosophers who actually make the argument that simply existing and then losing that existence is a form of suffering. So I think you're onto something, but I don't know if that's what we should prioritize. It's actually, they distinguish it, they call it the fear of annihilation. It's the fear of simply not existing anymore. Lonietta, you were going to say something.
I just wanted to say, you mentioned earlier in class that how they were going to, I guess, monitor a heartbeat, I guess, at 6 weeks or better, I guess. It's just still, like you said, it's a fine line. Like, how would you know, how do you know what the baby is feeling, first of all? And then second of all, like, you can only see how much the child has developed. Like, you don't know if, like, those nerves and things are actually, developed as well, where they can actually feel pain. So at the end of the day, I feel like you still don't know. So, you know, I don't know what to say or what's right or what's wrong.
Yeah, I guess there are some situations where for most people, the nervous system would be developed to a point where it could feel pain at about 27 weeks. But then can we say that, like, oh, this fetus is developing more slowly, and so technically it would take until 29 weeks? Yeah, stuff like that. There's one more thought that I want to leave everyone with before, because I do want to get to, there's my alarm for discussing the midterm. I think that the assumption, so when you bring life into the world, we kind of touched on this a little bit, where it's very possible that that child has an extremely positive value, it has a great life, a very positive life, a high quality life where it doesn't suffer a lot. Maybe it contributes to its community. It contributes to the well-being of the people around it. But there's also a chance that it won't, that it'll have a terrible life, that it will suffer immensely. And so every time that you bring a child into the world, really what you're doing is you're kind of throwing dice, right? You're gambling a little bit. And you can kind of stack the deck a little bit one way or another. If you have tons of resources, tons of money, you're well established within society, you have, the parents have high social status, they can afford nannies, they can do every single thing to make that child's life perfect. That really does stack the deck in the direction of saying that this child's probably going to have a good life. But I actually think for the vast majority of people who exist, that is not true. I think the vast majority of people who have a child and bring it into existence are probably on average going to give that child at least an average amount of suffering. If not, it's going to be a fairly large amount of suffering. I think we are all in this class pretty biased in that we live in a country that is fairly well developed, industrialized. We have access to a lot of medicine. We never really have to worry that food's going to be on the table. We have access to clean water, et cetera, et cetera. So we are making these decisions in many respects from a very, very privileged position. But if you look vastly across the world, the chances of women dying in childbirth, of children dying or being stillborn, or just dying shortly after they are birthed, their access to clean water and clean food, things like that, those are not, you can't assume those everywhere you go. So on average, if you're really rolling the dice with a child's well-being, I would say personally, you are more likely to produce a child that has a poor quality of life than to produce a child that has a good quality of life globally. Any reactions to that, if you want to, before we go over the midterm?
I do think that is true to a pretty good extent. Like, my parents weren't born in the U.S. They're originally from Mexico, and they always go on about how hard life was as a kid. But like, looking back at it, like, it probably, especially for my mom, because she lived in a very rural part of Mexico, not even like a city part, a very rural part. And she didn't have access to a grocery store. She didn't have access to clean water or electricity. And she would talk about how they would have to like literally live off the land and hunt and take some of the stuff that they would farm for themselves. And I guess, and she always talks about that, and then like she always talks about how hard like everybody suffered, including like her parents too, because she was one of, I think, 12 kids. And she always talks about how much they suffered. And looking at like my uncles and aunts' lives right now, they're not in the best situation they could be in financially, or like where they're living, like, or where they're living at, or anything.
Yeah, I could be biased here, but I really do think that the default state for life is suffering. I think that we all go through an immense amount of suffering, and it's by chance and goodwill and helping each other out and having a concern for other people's well-being, honestly, that probably reduces that suffering to the greatest degree. Otherwise, there's a lot of suffering out there, and I think it's important to remember that. All right. On that dark note, let's go to the midterm. Let's see. So, to introduce more suffering into your life, this is the midterm. At this point, it should be posted on Blackboard. It was set to release at 10:35 when I decided to discuss it. But here's the deal. I'm just going to read these instructions to you. It's clearer than I could be otherwise. Below is a list of questions. Follow the instructions and answer each question fully. Answers to each question should not exceed 2 to 3 paragraphs, 3 to 5 sentences per paragraph. Be concise, but thorough. I don't want you to put extra fluff in there. I just want you to answer the questions. But I want you, as you're answering those questions, to be very detailed. We've gone over a lot of detail in this class, and I want you to give that detail back to me. Use terminology from lecture and class. Your answers should be in your own words. Don't just regurgitate what I presented to you in the lectures. I want to know that you actually understand this material, and that if you had to explain it to someone else in your own words, you could do that. If it is clear that you've simply copied material from the lecture slides without digesting and processing the content, you will not receive full credit. Using examples where appropriate will often earn you a better score. What you should be thinking to yourself is, am I explaining this in a way that would make sense to someone who has never taken this class, who has never thought about these questions before? All right, so don't assume that you're talking to me. Assume that you are talking to someone who knows nothing. So your answers should be submitted in Microsoft Word via Blackboard before discussion on the day the midterm is due, which is 1 week from today. So before discussion next Monday. What you must do is you have to answer these 4 questions. These are required. Everyone has to answer these. You then have a choice of 7 questions of which you must answer 4. So you have a bit of choice there. All right. So I would just want to go through these questions real quick and make sure that they make sense. And if anyone has any kind of like, wait, I don't really get what you're asking for here, that we can address that now. So why does sex exist? What advantage does sexual reproduction provide that asexual reproduction, that is reproduction without the aid of sex, does not? This is what we started with. Remember that the basis of all this, the basis of sexuality is we are sexually reproducing organisms, and that provides a certain advantage. What advantage does it provide? Why would our bodies and our minds be shaped around sex to such a great degree? What is evolution and what is natural selection? Remember that these are 2 separate things. Evolution simply refers to change. Natural selection is a process by which that change occurs. Make sure you know that distinction. How are these different? And how does studying evolution help explain human sexuality in your own words? We went through this section. I'd like to know what you got from this. Try to give me something of how does evolution help inform why our sexuality is the way that it is. Please include examples of evolution and natural selection within your answer. You can make up I would prefer that you make up your own examples. Don't just copy stuff again from the lecture. Avoid copying stuff as much as you can. Challenge yourself here. 3, trace the pathway that sperm travels from creation to fertilization. We went through that. I said that this question would be there. I'll expect you to answer it. Describe each structure that the sperm passes through, including the epididymis, the seminal vesicles, the prostate and bulbourethral glands, and what all these things do, the pelvic floor muscles, the vagina, the endometrium, the inside layer of the uterus, the oviducts or the fallopian tubes, and then the ovaries. I want you to explain what these things are. Describe how they contribute to the process by which sexually reproducing organisms create new life, right? How people reproduce. In order, describe the 3 phases of the menstrual cycle. This is important as well. What physical changes occur in the endometrium during each phase, which pituitary and sex hormones. Distinguish those 2. Pituitary hormones are things like follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone. Those come from the brain and actually coordinate a lot of the rest of the menstrual cycle. And then the sex hormones, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. How do they fluctuate across the phase? What do each of those hormones do generally? I described this to a great degree, and describe how the quantity of each hormone changes across the menstrual cycle. That is how they fluctuate, how much is present at any given time. Questions about these first 4 questions? Any kind of concerns, anything unclear? The rest of the questions kind of hit things that I think are important, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a choice here in case some questions were a little harder than others. So describe the difference between sex and gender. This is something we covered at the very beginning, and this is going to become even more important as we go on to the second half of the class after the midterm, because we are going to start talking about gender a lot more. Right now, we've been focusing on kind of the basic biological structures and differences that occur between men and women. Then we're going to be getting into psychology, that is how the mind works, how people think about their own identity, how they express themselves to other people, some of their psychological preferences, things like that. So answering this question would be a good practice for what's coming up next. Why is it important to distinguish them? How are they similar? The rest of these we're out of time, but look through these, look through this document. What I want you to do is take these questions the easiest way. What I would say, create a Word document, a single Word document, copy and paste the question that you intend to answer it, and then submit that whole document as your submission. The midterm is available underneath, I want to say syllabus and course documents. Yeah, syllabus and course documents, that label in Blackboard. The submission link for the midterm is also in that same place. So once you've written all your answers up, submit it via that link and I will grade it. Questions about this? So it's all short answers.
When we answer the questions, we're answering as we're speaking to somebody who doesn't know about the topic, correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay.
It's not too bad. If you've been keeping up with the material, if you've been watching the lectures, if you've been thinking about this stuff and coming to discussion prepared and contributing, you should really have no problem with this. I think that this might look intimidating, but once you get your hands dirty and you start getting in there and answering these questions, it's pretty straightforward. I'm not asking you to invent something new here. I just want to know that you understand what we've been talking about. I want you to prove that to me. If you can prove that to me, you'll get a good grade. Sound good? Any questions? All right. Well, thank you for being here. It was an excellent discussion. And I will see you next Tuesday. Thanks all.